They called me the keeper of final accounts because I never forgot a name. For 19 years, I served as senior mortuary documentation specialist in the Basilica Mortis on Segmentum Obscura Station Epsilon 7, cataloging the honored dead, ensuring their sacrifices were recorded with reverence and precision. I took pride in this work, believed it sacred. I thought I understood the weight of imperial duty. But when Interrogator Vale delivered the sealed casket of Commander Halleck Thrain, and I opened the preliminary documentation before the ceremonial cleansing, I found the execution warrant dated 4 days before his final battle, 4 days before the enemy even arrived. My name is Dalton Kane. I held the rank of Adept Tertius in the Administrata Mortis, and I want you to understand this clearly. Every name I honored in my ledgers was chosen before their deaths mattered. This is how I learned that the Imperium does not punish failure. It manufactures it. The Basilica Mortis occupied the eastern wing of Epsilon 7, a cathedral of preservation where the honored dead received their final benedictions before interment or cremation. My quarters were adjacent to Archive Chamber 7, close enough that I could hear the hum of refrigeration units through the walls at night, a mechanical prayer that never ceased. I found comfort in that sound. It meant the work continued, that even in sleep the sacred duty of remembrance persisted. I rose each morning at the 6th bell, precisely 34 minutes before the shift rotation, allowing time for ablutions and the recitation of the litany of eternal service. The water from the purification font was always cold, 14 degrees exactly, preserved at the temperature recommended by the ecclesiarchy for maintaining clarity of thought. I would dress in my mortuary robes, the fabric rough against my skin, the weight of the ceremonial keys against my chest, a constant reminder of the responsibility I carried. My workspace was ordered, efficient, a reflection of the faith that structured my understanding. 3 cogitator terminals arranged in a precise triangle, each serving a distinct function. The left terminal accessed casualty reports from across the subsector, feeding me the raw data of sacrifice. The central terminal contained the master ledger, the great record where every death was given meaning through proper documentation. The right terminal connected to the orbital shrines and chapel ships, ensuring that last rites were distributed to the families of the fallen. Between these machines I sat for 12 hours each shift, processing death into dignity, chaos into order. The air tasted of machine oil and sanctified incense, sweet rot and metal. The smell of devotion made physical. I loved this work, that must be understood. I did not simply perform it out of obligation or fear. I believed with absolute certainty that what I did mattered, that each name I inscribed, each sacrifice I documented, each prayer I appended to a casualty file honored the Emperor's will and gave meaning to death. When a guardsman fell holding a trench on some forgotten hell world, when a naval officer died at their post as their ship burned, when a planetary governor was executed for incompetence that cost millions of lives, I ensured their deaths were recorded with the weight they deserved. The guilty received documentation of their crimes. The heroic received recognition of their valor. The system was just because I made it just through meticulous, faithful record keeping. My supervisor, Proctor Helmuth, would review my work each week. He was a broad man who had served in this position for 43 years, his face lined with the burden of witnessing so much death given form through paperwork. He never found errors in my documentation, never questioned my devotion. On my 10th anniversary of service, he commended me before the entire Basilica staff, called my faith unshakable, said my precision honored both the living and the dead. I remember the warmth of that praise, how it settled into my chest like a benediction. I was serving the Emperor through devotion to detail, through ensuring that death was never meaningless, never forgotten, never reduced to mere numbers. I prayed the prayer of the faithful scribe each night before sleep, thanking him for allowing me to serve in this capacity, for granting me the privilege of bearing witness to sacrifice. The work followed comfortable rhythms. Morning shift began with processing overnight casualty reports, typically 17 to 34 deaths, requiring documentation depending on current military operations in the subsector. I would cross-reference each report against command rosters, verify the chain of authorization, ensure proper cause of death was recorded according to administratum standards. Death in battle received classification Alpha. Death from negligence received classification Delta. Execution for heresy received classification Omega. Each had specific documentary requirements, specific prayers to append, specific procedures for family notification. By midday meal, I would have processed the morning reports and moved to archival work, updating historical records as new information became available, ensuring the Great Ledger remained current and accurate. Afternoons were reserved for special cases, deaths requiring additional documentation or investigation. Commanders who fell in battle. Inquisitorial casualties. High-ranking officials executed for corruption or incompetence. These files demanded extra care, additional verification, more extensive prayer and benediction. I took particular pride in this work, knowing that these deaths shaped the Imperium's future, that how I recorded them would influence how they were remembered for centuries. When a Lord Captain died ramming their vessel into a Chaos cruiser, saving an entire convoy, I spent 2 days crafting the proper documentation, ensuring their sacrifice would inspire generations of naval officers. When a planetary governor was executed for allowing heretical texts into his world's libraries, I documented every detail of his failure, creating a cautionary record that would prevent similar corruption. The evening shift was quietest, devoted to verification and quality assurance. I would review my day's work with fresh eyes, checking for inconsistencies, ensuring every signature was authentic, every authorization properly recorded. The Basilica grew silent during these hours, just the hum of machines and the distant sound of funeral rites being conducted in the ceremonial chambers. Sometimes I would walk through Archive Chamber 7, running my fingers along the stacked data slates, each one containing thousands of names, millions of deaths, all properly honored, all given meaning through documentation. The archive stretched back 3,000 years, an unbroken chain of remembrance. I was a link in that chain. The thought filled me with purpose. My faith was simple, absolute, untroubled. The Emperor protected humanity through the structures of the Imperium. Those structures required order, required discipline, required that failure be punished and sacrifice be honored. Death was the currency of survival in a hostile galaxy, and my role was to ensure that currency retained its value through proper accounting. Every name I recorded represented a soul that had served, whether through heroic sacrifice or through cautionary failure. Both mattered, both taught lessons, both honored him through the acknowledgement that human life existed to serve the species' continuation. This was not cruel. This was necessary. This was sacred. I had a small devotional shrine in my quarters, nothing elaborate, just a simple Aquila cast in bronze mounted above a prayer desk. Each night before sleep I would light a candle, recite the names of the dead I had documented that day, ask the Emperor to receive their service with favor. Sometimes the list was short. Sometimes it stretched for 20 minutes or more. I never abbreviated the ritual. Every name deserved to be spoken aloud, to have a human voice acknowledge their passing. This was my private devotion, my personal contribution beyond the official documentation. I believed it mattered. I believed he heard. My life beyond the work was minimal, deliberately so. I took meals in the station refectory, the food tasteless but nutritious, sufficient fuel for the body. I attended chapel services twice weekly, listening to Confessor Drayle speak of duty and sacrifice, of the necessity of order, of the Emperor's love manifesting through the structures that protected humanity from darkness. I had few friendships, finding most social interactions superficial compared to the meaningful work of honoring the dead. Occasionally, I would share conversation with other administratum staff, discussing procedural updates or processing techniques, but these were professional relationships, not personal ones. My purpose was clear. My faith was strong. I needed nothing else. 19 years I lived this way. 19 years of untroubled certainty. 19 years of believing the system I served was fundamentally just, that while individual corruption might exist, the structure itself was sound, built on principles that honored both the living and the dead through proper accounting of sacrifice. I was content. I was faithful. I was proud of my service. Then Commander Halleck Thrane's casket arrived, and everything I believed began to die. The delivery occurred during morning shift, 3 hours and 17 minutes after the 6th bell. I was processing routine casualties from a skirmish on the edge of the subsector when Interrogator Vale entered my workspace, accompanied by 2 Arbit's enforcers carrying a sealed adamantium casket. Vale was a thin woman with augmetic eyes that clicked and whirred when they focused, servomotors whirring in their sockets. She wore the rosette of the Inquisition openly, a statement of authority that made the air itself feel heavier. The enforcers placed the casket on the examination table with mechanical precision, then stepped back, hands resting on shock mauls. "Commander Halleck Thrane," Vale said, her voice flat and toneless. "Astra Militarum, 14th Corinthian Regiment, executed for catastrophic military negligence, resulting in the loss of an entire battalion. Documentation requires your immediate processing. The family has been informed. Cremation scheduled for tomorrow at the 9th bell." I stood, offering the sign of the Aquila in respect. "Of course, Interrogator. I will ensure proper documentation and benediction." She looked at me for 3 seconds exactly, her augmetic eyes adjusting focus twice. Then she nodded and left, the enforcers following. The door sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss. I was alone with the casket and the weight of duty. Standard procedure for command-level casualties required extensive documentation. I needed to verify the execution order, cross-reference the charges against military law, ensure proper chain of authorization from regimental command through munitorum oversight to final commissariat approval. I needed to document the nature of the negligence, the extent of casualties, the justification for execution rather than demotion or reassignment. Only after complete documentation could I authorize cremation and family notification. The process typically required 4 to 6 hours, depending on case complexity. I opened the preliminary documentation file, a standard data slate attached to the casket's exterior, expecting the usual forms. Authorization signature from the regimental commissar. Casualty report detailing the battalion's loss. Investigation summary outlining the commander's failure. Execution order with proper justification and approval chain. Everything in order, everything documented, everything just. The authorization signature was present, properly sealed. The casualty report detailed the loss of 843 guardsmen in a defensive engagement against Orc raiders. The investigation summary was thorough, documenting multiple instances of poor tactical judgment, inadequate reconnaissance, failure to establish proper defensive positions. Everything appeared correct. Everything followed proper procedure. Then I reached the execution order. The document was Form 771 Omega, Standard Commissariat Authorization for Command-Level Execution. The charges were clearly stated. The justification section was complete. The signature chain was proper. But the date was wrong. The execution order was dated 3/4/47. The Battle of Corinth Ridge, where Commander Thrane's battalion was destroyed, occurred 3/4/51. M41. 4 days. The execution order predated the battle by 4 days. I stared at the date for perhaps 30 seconds, my mind struggling to process the contradiction. This had to be an error, a simple clerical mistake. Someone had misdated the form, perhaps written the wrong month, transposed numbers. It happened occasionally in the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy. Nothing sinister, just human error requiring correction. I cross-referenced the date against the casualty report. The battle occurred 3/4/51. Confirmed 843 deaths. Verified through multiple sources. The after-action report, filed by the surviving senior officer, was dated 52/M41, 1 day after the battle. Standard timeline, proper documentation, but the execution order remained dated 3/4/47/M41. 4 days before, I checked the investigation summary, expecting to find an earlier inquiry that justified the pre-battle execution date. Perhaps Thrain had been under investigation for previous failures, and the Corinth Ridge disaster simply confirmed existing charges. That would explain the timeline. That would make sense. The investigation began 3/4/49 M41, 2 days after the execution order was issued. 2 days before the battle occurred. My hands were shaking. I set the data slate down carefully, took 3 slow breaths, recited the litany of clarity to calm my thoughts. There was an explanation. There had to be an explanation. The system was just. The system was ordered. This was simply a documentation error that required investigation and correction. My duty was to identify the discrepancy, report it to Proctor Helmuth, allow the proper authorities to investigate and resolve the issue. That was all. Just procedure. But something cold had settled in my chest. Something that tasted like the air from the refrigeration units. Like preservation and stasis and death. I accessed the master ledger, searching for additional documentation on Commander Thrain. Perhaps there were earlier files, previous investigations, a pattern of failure that justified preemptive action. Perhaps the dates were coded differently, referenced some internal timeline I didn't understand. Perhaps I was missing context that would make everything clear. The master ledger contained only one entry for Halleck Thrain. Commander, 14th Corinthian Regiment. 19 years of unblemished service. 7 commendations for tactical excellence. 3 successful defensive campaigns. No previous investigations. No prior disciplinary actions. No pattern of failure. Just an execution order dated 4 days before the failure it was meant to punish. I sat in silence for 10 minutes, maybe longer, listening to the hum of the cogitators, the distant sound of funeral rites, the mechanical prayer of preservation. My mind kept circling back to the dates, trying to force them into an order that made sense, that preserved the certainty I had carried for 19 years. Someone made a mistake. Someone misfiled a document. Someone transposed dates during data entry. These things happened. The system was vast. Errors were inevitable. This meant nothing except that I needed to report the discrepancy and let the proper authorities investigate. But the cold in my chest grew heavier, and for the first time in 19 years, I felt afraid of what proper procedure might reveal. I printed the documentation, needing physical copies, needing something tangible to verify what the cogitator displayed. The printer hummed, producing sheets of thin parchment marked with official seals. I laid them on my desk in chronological order. Execution order 3/4/47 M41. 441 battle occurs 3/4/51 Investigation concludes 3/4/54 M41. Execution carried out 3/4/55 M41. They killed him 8 days after the battle. 8 days after the failure that justified his death. 12 days after they decided he needed to die. I tried to make myself move, to stand, to walk to Proctor Helmuth's office and report the discrepancy as procedure demanded. But I remained seated, staring at the dates, watching my faith in the system's justice crack like ice under pressure. The documentation was clear. The dates were verified. This wasn't an error. This was the truth. Someone had decided Commander Halleck Thrain needed to die before he failed, then waited for failure to justify the decision already made. The question that haunted me, sitting in that cold workspace surrounded by the machinery of remembrance, was simple and terrible. How many other names in my ledgers had been chosen before their deaths mattered? I spent the rest of that shift processing the documentation mechanically, my hands moving through familiar procedures while my mind circled the implications. I completed the paperwork for Thrain's cremation. I prepared the family notification, carefully omitting any mention of the date discrepancy. I appended the proper prayers and benedictions, ensuring his death was honored according to protocol. Everything correct, everything procedural, everything a lie. When the shift ended, I did not return to my quarters. Instead, I remained at my desk, staring at the sealed casket on the examination table, wondering what kind of man Halleck Thrain had been. The documentation said he was 43 years old, married, father of 2 daughters. He had served the Emperor faithfully for 19 years, leading men with competence and honor. 7 commendations, 3 successful campaigns. Then someone decided he needed to die, and the system found a way to make it just. I thought about the 843 guardsmen who died at Corinth Ridge. The casualty report listed them by name, rank, regimental number. I had processed such reports thousands of times, seeing them as tragic but necessary sacrifices, the price of defending humanity against a hostile galaxy. But now I wondered, were they sacrifices, or were they ammunition? Had they died because of Thrain's tactical failures, or had they died to justify Thrain's predetermined execution? Had the battle been allowed to fail specifically to create the justification that someone needed? The thought made me physically ill. I leaned over the waste receptacle and retched, bringing up the tasteless meal from the refectory, my stomach rejecting the implications my mind was being forced to accept. 843 lives, 843 names I would have documented with reverence and precision, believing their deaths meant something, believing they had died defending humanity. But if Thrain's execution was predetermined, if the investigation was theater, if the dates proved conspiracy rather than justice, then those 843 deaths were not sacrifice. They were murder. Murder committed to justify another murder. Murder documented with prayers and benedictions and the seal of the administratum. Given legitimacy through the system I had served with absolute faith, I wiped my mouth with the sleeve of my robe and made a decision that would destroy everything I was. I would investigate, quietly, carefully, using my access to the archives and casualty databases. I would search for other cases where dates didn't align, where investigations reached conclusions before they began, where executions were decided before failures occurred. If this was an isolated incident, a singular corruption in an otherwise just system, I would find only Thrain's case and could report it properly, allow the authorities to purge the corruption and restore order. But if this was pattern, if this was policy, if the dates revealed systematic predetermination of guilt disguised as justice, then everything I had believed for 19 years was a lie, and every name I had honored in my ledgers was a victim of the system I served with pride. I began searching the archives immediately, my hands shaking as I entered query parameters into the cogitator. I needed cases similar to Thrain's, command-level executions for military negligence, with full documentation including investigation reports and execution orders. The master ledger contained 47 such cases in the past 10 years within our subsector. 47 commanders executed for failures that cost significant casualties. 47 names I had personally documented, believing their deaths were just consequences of incompetence or negligence, believing the system had weighed their failures and found them wanting. I pulled the first file. Commander Sorrel Ven, 12th Cadian Regiment, executed for failure to hold defensive position, resulting in loss of 300 guardsmen. I checked the dates with growing dread. Execution order dated 6 days before the battle. Investigation concluded 3 days after. Same pattern, same predetermined guilt. Second file. Colonel Thaddeus Crane, Haraconi Warhawks, executed for intelligence failure leading to ambush of drop troops. 217 casualties. Execution order dated 11 days before the ambush occurred. Investigation showed the intelligence was supplied by Munitorum headquarters, not gathered by Crane's own staff. He died for following orders that someone else issued, orders that someone had decided should result in his death before the ambush happened. Third file. Lord Captain Varric Stone, Imperial Navy, executed for losing a frigate to Chaos Raiders. Execution order dated 3 weeks before the engagement. Investigation report noted that the frigate was operating with minimal crew and failing engines. Deficiencies reported repeatedly by Stone in communications to Naval Command. Requests for reinforcement denied 4 times. He died for losing a battle he had begged not to fight with a ship he had documented was not combat ready. Fourth file. Fifth file. Sixth file. The pattern held. Every single commander executed for military failure in the past 10 years had their execution orders dated before the failures occurred. Every investigation concluded what had already been decided. Every death was predetermined, then justified retroactively through documentation that made predetermined murder appear as measured justice. By the 3rd hour past end of shift, I had reviewed 23 of the 47 cases, 23 executions where dates proved premeditated killing disguised as accountability. I stopped reviewing more, not because the pattern would change, but because my mind could not process additional evidence without fracturing. 23 commanders, thousands of guardsmen who died in their failures that might have been allowed to happen, might have been engineered, might have been designed specifically to create justification for executions already ordered. The cold in my chest had spread through my entire body. I sat shivering despite the temperature-controlled environment, my faith in systematic justice hemorrhaging through the cracks created by dates that refused to align properly. This was not corruption. Corruption was random, opportunistic, the work of individuals exploiting the system for personal gain. This was systematic. This was organized. This was policy disguised as procedure, genocide hidden inside bureaucracy, murder legitimized through proper documentation. And I had been the one documenting it. For 19 years, I had processed these deaths with reverence and precision, never questioning the dates, never investigating the timelines, never doubting that the executions were just because they were properly authorized. I had made the murders legitimate through meticulous record keeping. I had honored killers by documenting their kills with prayers and benedictions. I had served the system that manufactured failure to justify predetermined death, and I had done so with absolute faith that what I documented was truth. I looked at the sealed casket on the examination table, at the adamantium shell containing whatever remained of Halleck Thrain, commander, husband, father, a man who had served faithfully for 19 years before someone decided he needed to die, and waited for reality to provide justification. Inside that casket was evidence of my complicity, proof that I had been part of the machinery that transformed premeditated murder into honored justice through the alchemy of proper documentation. The prayer I had recited every night for 19 years turned to ash in my mouth. How could I thank the Emperor for allowing me to serve in this capacity when the capacity was documenting systematic murder? How could I pray for the souls of the dead I documented when many had died to justify decisions made before their deaths occurred? How could I maintain faith in a system that manufactured guilt to legitimize predetermined punishment? I could not, but I also could not immediately abandon 19 years of certainty, could not accept that everything I had believed, everything I had served, everything I had been proud of accomplishing was built on lies and predetermination and systematic murder hidden inside bureaucracy. I needed to understand more. I needed to find someone who could explain this in a way that preserved some shred of meaning, some fragment of justification, some reason why this horror might be necessary rather than simply evil. I thought of Proctor Helmuth, 43 years of service, 43 years of overseeing the documentation of death. Surely he had noticed the dates. Surely he had questioned the patterns. Surely he had an explanation, a context I was missing, a reason why what appeared to be systematic predetermination was actually necessary justice I simply didn't understand yet. He had called my faith unshakable. Perhaps his was stronger still. Perhaps he could show me why. This was right when everything in my breaking mind screamed it was wrong. I stood on shaking legs and walked toward his office, carrying the printed documentation, needing answers, needing rationalization, needing someone to tell me the dates meant something other than what they clearly proved. The corridors of the basilica were empty at this hour, just the hum of machinery and the distant sound of preservation. The mechanical prayer I had once found comforting, now sounding like the grinding of something vast and terrible feeding on the dead I had helped it consume. Proctor Helmuth's office was in the administrative wing, a space I had visited dozens of times for performance reviews and procedural updates. I knocked 3 times, heard his voice grant entry, stepped inside expecting to find answers that would restore the order of my understanding. Instead, I found a man sitting at his desk with a bottle of Amasec, hands shaking as he poured another glass, eyes hollow and exhausted in a way I had never noticed before. "Kane," he said, voice rough, "you found the dates." It was not a question. He knew. He had always known. For 43 years he had processed documentation containing predetermined guilt, disguised as justice, and he had done so knowing exactly what the dates proved. I set the printed documentation on his desk, unable to speak, unable to do anything except stare at the man I had respected for 19 years and realize I had never actually seen him at all. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We need to talk about how the Imperium actually works." I sat, I listened, and everything I had believed began to die in earnest. "The dates are not errors," Helmuth said, taking a long drink. "They are policy, deliberate, systematic, part of a doctrine that extends far beyond this station, beyond this subsector, throughout the entire structure of Imperial military administration. It has a name. They call it the doctrine of necessary failure." He pulled a leather-bound volume from his desk drawer, its cover marked with the seal of the Munitorum and the inquisitorial rosette. The text was old, the pages yellowed, the ink faded in places. He opened it to a marked section and turned it so I could read. "Humanity survives through fear." I read aloud, my voice distant. "The Emperor protects, but protection requires obedience. Obedience requires the regular demonstration that failure results in absolute consequences. Successful commanders create loyalty to themselves. Failed commanders create loyalty to the Imperium. Thus, failure must be manufactured when success threatens proper hierarchy. The loss of a battalion is acceptable cost to remind an entire sector that the Emperor's justice is inevitable." I looked up from the text, my mind refusing to process what I had just read. "This is official doctrine, written by Lord Inquisitor Valdane 3,000 years ago," Helmuth said. "Required reading for anyone who advances past adept rank in the Administratum Mortis. You were scheduled to receive this next year when I recommended your promotion, but you found the dates early, so we have this conversation now instead." "You knew?" I said, the words barely a whisper. "For 43 years, you knew every execution you documented was predetermined murder, and you processed the documentation anyway." "Yes." No hesitation, no shame, just exhausted acceptance. "Because the alternative is not justice, Kane. The alternative is collapse. Do you understand what happens when successful commanders build personal loyalty among their troops? When regiments follow their officers rather than their commissars? When charismatic leaders inspire devotion that supersedes devotion to the Imperium itself? You get warlords. You get secession. You get civil war and fracturing, and the slow dissolution of the structures that protect humanity from extinction." He refilled his glass, offered me the bottle. I shook my head. He shrugged and drank. "The doctrine of necessary failure prevents that," he continued. "We identify commanders who are becoming too successful, too beloved, too capable of inspiring personal loyalty. We wait for an engagement where casualties are inevitable, where the fog of war provides sufficient ambiguity. We issue execution orders predated to before the battle. Then we ensure the battle goes poorly enough to justify the execution we have already authorized. The commander dies. The troops see that even beloved leadership cannot save you from the Emperor's justice. Loyalty flows back toward the institution, not the individual." 843 guardsmen, I said, my voice cracking. 843 men died at Corinth Ridge to justify killing Halleck, Thrain. They died because someone needed him dead. They died because the 14th Corinthian was starting to call themselves Thrain's regiment, Helmuth said. Because Thrain was popular, competent, inspiring. Because given another 5 years he might have commanded their loyalty above their commissar's authority. So yes, we identified him for necessary failure. We issued the execution order. We assigned his regiment to a defensive position we knew was untenable against the Orc force in that sector. We provided insufficient reconnaissance. We ensured support would arrive 3 hours too late. The battle failed. 843 men died. Thrain was executed for negligence. And now the survivors of the 14th Corinthian understand that no amount of affection for their commander will protect him if he fails the Emperor. Lesson taught. Loyalty redirected. Sector stabilized. I stood, my legs shaking, my hands clenched into fists. That is murder. Systematic, premeditated murder. Those men died for theater, for political convenience, for the maintenance of a system that requires regular sacrifice of the innocent to function. Yes, Helmuth said calmly. That is exactly what it is. Murder disguised as justice, documented with precision, given legitimacy through bureaucracy. That is your job, Kane. That is what you have been doing for 19 years. You have been honoring systematic murder with proper record-keeping, making premeditated killing appear as measured accountability. You have been complicit in genocide, hidden inside administrative procedure. The word complicit hit me like a physical blow. I sank back into the chair, my mind fragmenting, my certainty evaporating. 19 years, thousands of names. How many had I documented whose deaths were predetermined? How many families had I sent notification letters to, telling them their sons, their fathers, their husbands had died honorably when they had actually died as ammunition for political theater? Why? I managed. Why are you telling me this? Why not just let me continue in ignorance? Because you found the dates, Helmuth said. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Because you will either accept the necessity of this system and become part of its conscious operation, or you will refuse and be removed. Those are your only options. Ignorance is no longer available. What does removed mean? He looked at me with exhausted sympathy. Exactly what you think it means. We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the clink of his glass against the desktop, the distant hum of preservation machinery, the grinding of the system we served consuming the innocent and calling it justice. I thought about the 843 names in Thrain's casualty report, names I would have documented with reverence if I had not found the dates. I thought about the 23 commanders whose files proved systematic predetermination. I thought about the thousands of guardsmen who had died in their manufactured failures. I thought about 19 years of faithful service that had actually been 19 years of complicity in systematic murder. The other files, I said, the 23 cases I reviewed, all predetermined, all of them, Helmuth confirmed, plus the 24 you did not yet review. 47 necessary failures in 10 years in this subsector alone. Approximately 8,000 guardsmen died in those failures, all predetermined, all documented properly, all given meaning through the prayers and benedictions you appended to their casualty reports. The numbers scale across the Imperium. Millions die annually in necessary failures, tens of millions over decades. The system requires regular blood sacrifice to maintain order, and you have been the priest conducting the ritual. Why does it have to be this way? I asked, hating how my voice broke, hating the desperation in the question. Why cannot the Imperium maintain order through actual justice, through rewarding competence, through building loyalty based on truth rather than fear? Helmuth laughed, a bitter sound without humor. Because truth and justice do not scale, Kane. You can spare one commander. You can reward competence in one regiment, but multiply that across 10,000 worlds, 1,000,000 regiments, billions of soldiers, and individual competence becomes threat. Charismatic leadership becomes warlordism. Truth becomes rebellion. The Imperium is too vast for justice. It survives through fear, through the regular demonstration that failure results in death, and no amount of success protects you from predetermined guilt if the system requires your removal. He leaned forward, his exhausted eyes meeting mine. I have questioned this for 43 years. Every execution I document, every predetermined death I process, I ask myself if there is another way, if we could build something better, something that did not require systematic murder disguised as accountability. And every time I reach the same conclusion, yes, we could build something better, but it would collapse within a generation, fracture into civil war, leave humanity defenseless against external threats. The doctrine of necessary failure is evil, objectively, undeniably evil, but the alternative is extinction. So I choose the evil that preserves survival over the justice that would lead to death. I have made that choice for 43 years. Now you must make it too. What if I refuse? I asked. What if I cannot accept that murder is necessary, that systematic predetermination is justified, that everything I believed was a lie? Then you will be removed, he said simply. Your position will be filled by someone else who either accepts the necessity or remains ignorant. The system continues regardless. Your conscience is irrelevant to its operation. You can choose to be part of maintaining it consciously, or you can be removed and someone else will take your place. Those are your options. There is no third choice. I stood again, needing to move, needing to escape the office and the man and the choice he was forcing me to acknowledge. I need time to think. You have until tomorrow morning, Helmuth said. At the 6th bell you will report here and tell me your decision. If you accept the necessity of the doctrine, you will continue your work with full understanding of what you document. If you refuse, you will be transferred to a position where this knowledge cannot be shared. Do you understand what transferred means? I understood. Transferred meant execution or servitorization or exile to a position where speaking was impossible. The system protected itself through removing those who refused complicity. There was no resigning, no walking away, no option to simply stop participating. You served with ignorance, with conscious acceptance, or you were removed. Those were the only possibilities. I left his office without another word, walking through the empty corridors of the basilica, past the archive chambers containing millions of names, past the examination rooms where bodies were prepared for final rites, past the ceremonial spaces where families received notification of loss. Everything looked different now. Every space was a theater for legitimizing murder. Every procedure was a ritual disguising genocide as justice. Every prayer I had recited was a benediction over victims I had helped the system consume. I did not return to my quarters. Instead, I went to the observation dome on the station's eastern arm, a space used for contemplation and prayer. Looking out at the void beyond, stars scattered across infinite darkness, cold and distant and uncaring. I had come here dozens of times over 19 years, finding peace in contemplating the Emperor's vast domain, the countless worlds protected by the system I served. Now I saw only the weight of all those worlds, the impossible scale that Helmuth claimed made justice obsolete, the vastness that supposedly justified murder as necessary maintenance. I tried to pray. The words would not come. The litany of eternal service felt hollow, a script for a play I no longer believed. The prayer of the faithful scribe was obscene, thanking the Emperor for allowing me to honor the dead, when I had actually been legitimizing their murder. Every devotion I had recited for 19 years tasted of ash and complicity. I could not pray to a system built on systematic predetermination of guilt. I could not ask blessing for work that consisted of documenting genocide, disguised as justice. But neither could I accept Helmuth's conclusion that evil was necessary, because the alternative was extinction. That logic justified anything. If fear was required for order, why not execute randomly? If murder maintained hierarchy, why not simply slaughter thousands poor, encourager les autres? Where was the line between necessary evil and evil made necessary through commitment to maintaining systems that required it? If the Imperium survived only through regular sacrifice of the innocent, disguised as justice, then perhaps the Imperium itself was the threat humanity needed protection from. The thought was heresy. Absolute, undeniable heresy. The Imperium was humanity's only defense against chaos, against Xenos, against the darkness that sought to consume the species. Without its structures, without its hierarchy, without its vast military and administrative machinery, humanity would fragment and die. This was foundational truth, the bedrock upon which every other certainty rested. To question the Imperium's necessity was to question humanity's survival. But if the Imperium required systematic murder to function, if its survival demanded regular sacrifice of innocence, if maintaining order meant manufacturing guilt to justify predetermined execution, then was that survival worth the cost? How many innocent deaths were acceptable to preserve structures that demanded innocent deaths as the price of their maintenance? When did necessary evil become simply evil that had been normalized through repetition? I had no answers. I stood in the observation dome for hours, watching stars drift across the void, trying to reconcile 19 years of faithful service with the horror of what that service actually accomplished. I thought about Halleck Thrain, commander, husband, father, a man whose competence and charisma had made him a threat to be eliminated. I thought about his daughters, receiving notification that their father had died honorably in the Emperor's service when he had actually died as predetermined sacrifice to maintain political order. I thought about the 843 guardsmen whose deaths I would have documented with reverence, never knowing they had died as ammunition for theater. I thought about all the names in my ledgers, thousands upon thousands, decades of documentation. How many were necessary failures? How many died not because of actual heresy or incompetence or enemy action, but because the system required regular demonstrations that failure meant death? How many families received notifications I had carefully crafted, telling them their loved ones had served with honor, when the truth was those loved ones had been murdered for political convenience, and I had been the one making that murder appear just through proper documentation. The weight crushed me. Not the weight of the decision Helmuth demanded, but the weight of 19 years of complicity I had performed with absolute faith. I had believed my work honored the dead. I had believed my meticulous documentation gave meaning to sacrifice. I had believed the system was fundamentally just because I made it just through proper record keeping. But I had been wrong. Terribly. Absolutely wrong. My faith had not made the work honorable. My faith had made me the perfect instrument for legitimizing murder, because I had documented genocide with such reverence and precision that no one questioned whether the deaths I honored were actually just. As dawn cycle approached, bringing artificial light to the station's corridors, I realized I had already made my decision. Not the decision Helmuth wanted, not acceptance of necessary evil, but the decision that came before that choice. I needed to know more. I needed to understand the full extent of the doctrine of necessary failure, how deep it went, how widely it was practiced, whether this was isolated policy or fundamental operating principle of the entire Imperium. If this was corruption in a single subsector, it could be reported and purged. But if this was systematic, if the dates proved consistent across sectors and centuries, if the doctrine extended throughout the vast machinery of imperial administration, then I needed to understand what I was actually part of before deciding whether to remain complicit or refuse and face removal. I returned to my workspace at the 6th bell, but I did not go to Helmuth's office. Instead, I accessed the Master Archive, using my credentials to pull documentation from across the segmentum, searching for patterns in execution dates and investigation timelines. If the doctrine of necessary failure was systematic rather than isolated, the pattern would hold across multiple subsectors, multiple decades, multiple levels of command. The dates would tell the story. For 3 days I searched, barely sleeping, eating only when my hands shook too badly to operate the cogitator. I pulled thousands of files, execution records spanning 2 centuries, command-level accountability cases from dozens of subsectors. I created spreadsheets comparing execution order dates to failure dates to investigation conclusion dates. I cross-referenced casualty numbers against tactical assessments, looking for battles that should have succeeded but were allowed to fail. I documented everything with the same precision I had used for 19 years, except now I was documenting the system's crimes rather than legitimizing them. The pattern held. Across the segmentum, across 2 centuries, across thousands of cases, the pattern held. Execution orders predated failures by days or weeks. Investigations concluded after executions were already authorized. Battles were lost despite tactical advantages, despite competent commanders, despite intelligence indicating success was possible. Beloved officers were removed. Successful leaders were eliminated. Competence was punished. Charisma was fatal. Anyone who inspired personal loyalty above institutional obedience was identified, marked, and murdered through manufactured failure. The numbers were staggering. In the past century alone within Segmentum Obscurus, I documented 3,862 necessary failures, 3,862 commanders executed for failures that were predetermined, manufactured, designed specifically to justify executions already ordered. The casualty numbers in those failures totaled 4.2 million guardsmen. 4.2 million deaths that occurred not because of enemy action or tactical necessity, but because the Imperium required regular blood sacrifice to maintain hierarchy and order. 4.2 million names that would have been documented with prayers and benedictions, given meaning through proper record keeping, honored as sacrifice when they were actually murder victims of the system they served with loyalty. 4.2 million families who received notifications explaining their loved ones died heroically in the Emperor's service, when the truth was they died as ammunition for political theater. And that was one segmentum over 1 century. The Imperium had 5 segmentums. The doctrine had been in operation for 3 millennia. I tried to calculate the total deaths, the sum of systematic murder disguised as accountability, but the numbers became meaningless. Millions became tens of millions, became hundreds of millions, became a number so vast it lost connection to individual human suffering. The Imperium survived through genocide made mundane, through murder made policy, through systematic predetermination of guilt documented so properly, so precisely, so reverently that no one questioned whether the deaths recorded were actually just. On the 4th day, Proctor Helmuth found me at my workspace surrounded by printed documentation, data slates, stacked in towers, the evidence of 2 centuries of systematic murder, laid out across every available surface. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, looking at what I had compiled, then entered and closed the door behind him. "You did not report at the 6th bell 3 days ago," he said. "You made a choice through inaction. Now we must discuss consequences." I did not look at him, continuing to organize the casualty data by subsector and decade. The pattern holds across the entire segmentum. 2 centuries of consistent practice, 3,862 predetermined executions, 4.2 million casualties in manufactured failures. This is not corruption. This is not isolated policy. This is fundamental operating principle of imperial military administration. "Yes," he said simply. "Did you expect something different?" I expected evidence that would allow me to believe this was aberration rather than design, I said, finally looking at him. I wanted to find that the dates were errors, that the doctrine was corruption, that the system I served for 19 years was fundamentally just with localized failures. Instead, I found evidence that the injustice is the system, that murder is policy, that genocide is maintained through proper documentation. Everything I believed was a lie. Helmuth sat in the chair across from my desk, looking even more exhausted than 3 days prior. Everything you believed was a simplification. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension. 10,000 worlds, quadrillions of souls, military forces numbered in billions, administrative complexity that defies understanding. At that scale, individual justice becomes impossible. The system survives through fear, through hierarchy, through regular demonstration that failure results in absolute consequences. That requires manufactured failure when success threatens proper order. That requires documented genocide disguised as accountability. That requires people like us who process the murder with such precision that it appears as justice. This is how the Imperium actually works. Not how we wish it worked, not how we tell ourselves it works, how it actually works. Then the Imperium is evil, I said, objectively, undeniably, evil. Perhaps, he agreed. But it is also all that prevents human extinction. The alternative to the Imperium is not justice. The alternative is fragmentation, civil war, vulnerability to threats that would annihilate the species. You can call it evil, but that does not change the calculation. Survival requires structures. Structures require maintenance. Maintenance requires sacrifice. The doctrine of necessary failure is the sacrifice the system demands to continue functioning. You can refuse to participate, but that does not stop the system. It simply means someone else documents the deaths you would have honored. How many? I asked. How many people across the Imperium understand the doctrine? How many are consciously complicit in systematic murder disguised as justice? Thousands in the Administratum, Helmuth said. Hundreds in the Munitorum. Dozens in the Inquisition. everyone past adept rank in mortality documentation, everyone involved in execution authorization, everyone who reviews casualty reports and cross-references timelines. Once you reach a certain level of access, the dates become visible, and you are given the choice I offered you 3 days ago. Most accept. Some refuse and are transferred. A few attempt to expose the system and are removed permanently. The doctrine protects itself through removing those who will not maintain it. What about the commissars who execute the orders? I asked. The inquisitors who authorize the investigations. The lord generals who assign forces to battles designed to fail. How many know the deaths they authorize are predetermined? Most do not know, Hummuth said. They receive orders. They follow procedures. They execute commanders for documented failures without realizing the failures were manufactured. The system is designed with compartmentalization. Only those who need to understand the doctrine fully are given access to the dates. Everyone else operates within their level of knowledge, believing they serve justice when they actually serve maintenance of hierarchy through systematic murder. This is intentional. Faith makes better instruments than conscious complicity. I thought about that. About 19 years of faithful service that had made me the perfect instrument precisely because I believed the deaths I documented were just. My faith had made my work flawless because I processed murder with reverence, gave genocide legitimacy through proper record keeping, honored systematic predetermination through meticulous documentation. The system had not corrupted me. The system had used my incorruptible faith to make murder appear as justice. You said I made a choice through inaction, I said. What happens now? Helmuth looked at the documentation surrounding us, at the evidence of 2 centuries I had compiled. That depends on what you intend to do with this. If you compiled it to understand the scope before accepting necessity, then you file it away and continue your work with full knowledge of what you document. If you compiled it to expose the doctrine, then you must be removed before that exposure occurs. Which is it, Cain? I did not answer immediately. The question was more complex than he framed it. Exposing the doctrine would accomplish nothing. Anyone with sufficient access to verify my evidence already knew the truth and had chosen to maintain the system. Anyone without sufficient access would dismiss the dates as errors or misunderstanding, would trust the authorities who would explain away the contradictions, would choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth. The Imperium was too vast for one person's testimony to damage, too entrenched for evidence to topple, too necessary for horror to undermine. Exposing the doctrine would change nothing except guaranteeing my removal. But accepting the doctrine, continuing my work with conscious knowledge that every execution I documented might be predetermined murder, that every casualty I honored might have died in manufactured failure, that every prayer I appended might be benediction over genocide, disguised as justice, accepting that as necessary for humanity's survival. That would require becoming something I was not. That would require believing that systematic murder was justified if the alternative was collapse. That would require faith in the Imperium's necessity exceeding my horror at the Imperium's operation. I did not have that faith anymore. The dates had killed it. I cannot accept the doctrine as necessary, I said finally. I cannot document predetermined murder with reverence and call it justice. I cannot maintain faith in a system that survives through genocide made mundane. I know exposure would accomplish nothing. I know refusal changes nothing about the system's operation, but I cannot be complicit anymore. I cannot continue serving even knowing my replacement will do the work I refuse. This is not strategic. This is not calculated. This is simply all I have left, the ability to refuse. The right to say this is wrong even if saying so is futile. Helmuth nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his exhausted eyes. Then you have made your choice. I am sorry, Cain. You were good at this work, better than most. Your faith made you an excellent instrument. But the system cannot allow conscious refusal to exist. You will be transferred. What does that mean specifically? I asked. Execution, servitorization, memory wipe and reassignment to some prison world where I cannot speak what I know. That is not my decision, Helmuth said. Interrogator Vale will arrive within the hour. She will assess whether your knowledge and evidence presents sufficient threat to require permanent removal or whether transfer to a position of enforced silence is sufficient. I recommend you prepare yourself mentally. The process is not pleasant regardless of which option she selects. He stood, moved toward the door, then paused. For what it is worth, I understand your choice. I have made the opposite choice for 43 years, accepted the necessity of the doctrine, documented systematic murder with proper procedure, maintained conscious complicity because I believed the alternative was worse. But I have never been certain I was right. I have never stopped questioning whether this is truly necessary or simply evil that has been normalized through repetition. You have the courage to refuse what I have lacked the strength to resist. That means something, even if it changes nothing about the system's operation. He left, sealing the door behind him, leaving me alone with 2 centuries of evidence and the knowledge that within an hour I would face judgment for refusing to remain complicit in systematic murder. I thought about destroying the documentation, removing evidence of my investigation, but that would accomplish nothing. The dates existed in the master archive. Anyone with access could compile what I had compiled. The evidence was not the threat. My refusal to accept it as necessary was the threat. I spent the remaining time writing testimony, documenting everything I had discovered, everything I understood about the doctrine of necessary failure, every calculation I had made regarding the scope of systematic murder disguised as justice. I did not write it for exposure. I wrote it for record. Someone needed to state clearly what the system actually was, how it operated, what cost it demanded for humanity's survival. Someone needed to say this is wrong, even knowing that statement would change nothing. Someone needed to refuse even when refusal was futile. I was halfway through documenting the casualty calculations when Interrogator Vale arrived, accompanied by the same 2 Arbites enforcers who had delivered Thrain's casket. She looked at the documentation surrounding me, at the data slates and printed sheets, an evidence of 2 centuries, then looked at me with those clicking, wearing augmetic eyes. "Adept Kane," she said, voice flat and mechanical. "You are charged with possessing classified information above your clearance level, conducting unauthorized investigation into protected Imperial doctrine, and compiling evidence with intent to undermine proper military administration. How do you respond to these charges?" "Guilty," I said simply. I found dates that prove systematic predetermination of guilt. I investigated to understand the scope. I compiled evidence because someone needed to document what the doctrine of necessary failure actually accomplishes. I refuse to remain complicit in genocide disguised as justice, even knowing refusal changes nothing about the system's operation. She nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. "You understand the doctrine is classified at inquisitorial authority level. You understand its exposure would undermine military morale and threaten sector stability. You understand your refusal to accept its necessity makes you a liability to proper order. Yet you refuse to recant or accept transfer to continued service with conscious knowledge." "I refuse," I confirmed, "not because I believe it will change the system, not because I think my testimony matters, because this is all I have left, the right to say this is wrong and refuse to participate even when that refusal is futile." Vale was silent for nearly a minute, her augmetic eyes focusing and refocusing on my face, scanning for something I could not identify. Finally she spoke, and for the first time her voice held something other than mechanical flatness. "Exhaustion, perhaps, or recognition. I have conducted this assessment 47 times in my service," she said. 47 individuals who discovered the doctrine and refused to accept its necessity. 39 accepted transfer to positions of enforced silence. 8 required permanent removal. You are different from both categories. You do not seek exposure. You do not claim moral superiority. You simply state you cannot continue serving, even knowing your refusal accomplishes nothing. That is unusual. Does unusual mean I live? I asked. It means I am uncertain, she said, and that admission felt more honest than anything anyone had said to me in days. You possess dangerous knowledge, but lack intent to weaponize it. You refuse complicity, but acknowledge the futility of refusal. You understand the system's logic, but reject its necessity. Standard protocol would be servitorization or execution, but standard protocol assumes threat, and I am not convinced you present threat so much as principled futility. She walked to my desk, looked at the testimony I had been writing. You are documenting your understanding, not for exposure, for record, because someone needs to state what the system actually is. That is not threat, that is testimony. Futile testimony, but testimony nonetheless. What happens to me? I asked. Exile, she said finally. Not execution, not servitorization. Exile to a position where your knowledge cannot spread, but your refusal can be maintained. There is a world at the edge of the segmentum, barely habitable, colony of the convicted and the exiled. You will be transferred there with sealed records indicating only administrative failure. You will live out your remaining years in obscurity, unable to share what you know, unable to influence the system. You refuse to serve, unable to do anything except maintain your conscience at the cost of everything else. Why? I asked. Why not simply remove me permanently? Vale's augmetic eyes clicked, focused on me with something that might have been sympathy. Because I have executed 8 people for refusing the doctrine. 8 people who saw the dates and could not accept the necessity. 8 executions I authorized knowing they were predetermined, knowing the investigation was theater, knowing I was doing exactly what the doctrine describes. I am exhausted, Adept Kane. I am exhausted of being the instrument through which the system removes those who refuse complicity. So I am choosing a different option. Exile instead of execution. Silence instead of servitorization. I cannot stop serving the doctrine, but I can show mercy within the confines of my authority. Consider it a gift from someone who understands your refusal but lacks your courage to enact it. She gestured to the enforcers. You will be taken to holding, processed for transfer, shipped to the exile world within 3 days. Your testimony will be sealed in inquisitorial archives, unread but preserved. Your position will be filled by someone who either accepts the doctrine or remains ignorant. The system continues regardless of your choice, but you will live Kane, exiled, silenced, futile, but alive and able to maintain the conscience that forced your refusal. The enforcers moved forward, placed restraints on my wrists, began leading me toward the door. I looked back at my workspace one final time, at the evidence of 2 centuries I had compiled, at the testimony I had written, at the space where I had served for 19 years believing my work honored the dead, when I had actually been legitimizing their murder. The families, I said to Vale, the families of the 4.2 million casualties in manufactured failures. Do they ever learn the truth? Do they ever discover their loved ones did not die heroically, but were murdered for political convenience? No, Vale said. They receive notification that their loved ones serve the Emperor with honor. They grieve properly. They accept the sacrifice as necessary. They maintain faith in the system. That faith allows them to continue serving, allows the Imperium to continue extracting service, allows the machinery to continue functioning. Truth would accomplish nothing except breaking that faith, leaving them with grief untempered by meaning. The system protects them from the truth, because the truth serves no purpose except destroying their ability to continue serving. Mercy through lies, I said. Is there another kind? Vale asked. I had no answer. The enforcers led me from the Basilica Mortis, through corridors I had walked for 19 years, past archive chambers containing millions of names I had documented with faith and precision, past the examination rooms where I had processed the honored dead, past the space where I had believed my work mattered. Everything looked different now, transformed by understanding from sacred to profane, from honorable to horrific, from meaningful to monstrous. The exile world was called Redemption's End, though I learned quickly that name was bitter irony. There was no redemption here, only exile, only the gathering of those who had refused to serve the Imperium in ways demanded of them. Political dissidents who questioned too loudly, minor officials who exposed corruption, soldiers who refused immoral orders. All of us sent here to maintain conscience at the cost of relevance, to preserve principle while accomplishing nothing, to refuse complicity while knowing our refusal changed nothing about the system's operation. I have lived here for 3 years now. I work in the agricultural communes, growing food for the exile population, using my hands in ways that accomplish something tangible, if meaningless. I have friends here, other refusers, other people who could not accept the system's demands regardless of the cost of refusal. We talk sometimes about what we refused, what we discovered, what price we paid for maintaining conscience. None of us believes we changed anything. None of us believes our refusals mattered, but we maintain them anyway, because refusal is all we have left. I think about the Basilica Mortis often, about my replacement processing deaths with the same reverence I once brought to the work, about families receiving notifications carefully crafted to give meaning to murder, about the thousands of commanders across the Imperium whose execution orders are being written before their failures occur, about the millions of guardsmen who will die in manufactured failures designed to justify predetermined guilt, about the system grinding forward, consuming the innocent and calling it justice, maintained through proper documentation and faithful record-keeping. I think about Halleck Thrain, commander, husband, father, whose casket revealed dates that killed my faith. I wonder if his daughters know the truth, if somewhere in their grief they question the narrative they were given, if the dates would matter to them the way they mattered to me. Probably not. Probably they grieved properly, accepted the sacrifices necessary, maintained faith in the system that murdered their father for political convenience. Probably the truth would serve no purpose for them except destroying their ability to continue living. I think about Proctor Hellmouth, 43 years of conscious complicity, 43 years of documenting systematic murder, while questioning whether it was truly necessary. I wonder if he still questions. I wonder if my refusal changed anything in how he understands his continued service. Probably not. Probably he continues processing the dates with exhausted acceptance, choosing the evil he believes prevents extinction, making the calculation he has made for 43 years that genocide is justified if the alternative is collapse. I think about Interrogator Vale, exhausted from executing 8 people for refusing the doctrine, choosing mercy through exile rather than continuing the pattern. I wonder if that choice cost her anything, if showing mercy within the confines of her authority changed how she understands her continued service to the system. Probably not. Probably she continues assessing refusers, choosing execution or exile based on calculations I do not understand, serving the doctrine she admitted exhausted her. I do not know if any of this matters. I do not know if my refusal accomplished anything except preserving my conscience at the cost of relevance. I do not know if testimony sealed in inquisitorial archives serves any purpose except documenting futility. I do not know if exile is meaningfully different from execution, except that I continue breathing and thinking and remembering 19 years of faithful service that was actually 19 years of complicity in genocide. But I know the dates were real. The pattern was systematic. The doctrine of necessary failure exists and operates throughout the Imperium, maintained through proper documentation, legitimized through bureaucracy, made mundane through repetition. 4.2 million deaths in one segmentum over 1 century, all predetermined, all manufactured, all documented with prayers and benedictions that gave murder the appearance of justice. That truth exists regardless of whether anyone else acknowledges it. That truth exists regardless of whether acknowledging it changes anything about the system's operation. I am writing this testimony from redemption's end, 3 years into exile, knowing it will never be read by anyone who could change the system, knowing it accomplishes nothing except documenting what the Imperium actually is beneath the prayers and benedictions. I am writing this because someone needs to state clearly the system survives through systematic murder disguised as accountability. The Imperium maintains order through genocide made mundane. The Emperor protects through structures that demand regular sacrifice of innocence to continue functioning. This is not corruption. This is design. This is not failure. This is policy. This is not aberration. This is the Imperium, My name is Dalton Kane. I served as Senior Mortuary Documentation Specialist for 19 years, documenting the honored dead with faith and precision, believing my work gave meaning to sacrifice. I was wrong. My work legitimized murder. My faith made me the perfect instrument for processing genocide. My meticulous documentation made systematic predetermination appear as measured justice. I discovered the truth when I found dates that would not align, when I compiled evidence of 2 centuries of necessary failures, when I calculated the cost in millions of deaths manufactured to maintain hierarchy and order. I refused to remain complicit, even knowing refusal accomplished nothing. I was exiled for that refusal, sent to this world at the edge of the segmentum, where principle can be maintained at the cost of relevance. I do not know if this testimony matters. I do not know if documenting the truth serves any purpose when the truth changes, nothing about the system's operation. I do not know if refusal has meaning when the system continues regardless of who refuses it. But I know I could not continue serving. I know I could not document another death with reverence, while knowing it might be predetermined murder. I know I could not maintain faith in justice. That was actually systematic predetermination of guilt disguised through proper procedure. So I refused. I was exiled. I continue living futile and irrelevant and unable to change anything, but alive and able to maintain the conscience that forced my refusal. That is all I have. That is all any of us here at Redemption's End have. The right to refuse, even when refusal is futile. The ability to say this is wrong, even when saying so changes nothing. The courage to accept exile rather than complicity. Principle rather than relevance. Conscience rather than service. The Imperium will continue. The doctrine of necessary failure will continue. Commanders will be identified, marked, executed through manufactured failures. Millions will die as ammunition for political theater. Families will receive carefully crafted notifications giving meaning to murder. And someone will sit in my former workspace, processing the dates with faith and precision, believing their work honors the dead, never knowing they legitimize genocide through meticulous documentation. That someone could have been me for another 19 years if I had accepted the necessity Helmuth offered. That someone could have been me if I had possessed the strength to make his calculation. To choose systematic evil over the collapse he believed was the alternative. That someone could have been me if I had been able to maintain faith in the Imperium's necessity, exceeding my horror at the Imperium's operation. But I could not. The dates killed that faith. The pattern revealed the system's true nature. The doctrine showed me what I actually was, an instrument for legitimizing murder, a priest conducting rituals that disguised genocide as justice, a faithful servant whose faith made him the perfect tool for processing deaths that should never have occurred. I am exiled now, silenced, futile, unable to change the system or expose the doctrine or save a single life from predetermined death. But I am able to refuse. I am able to maintain conscience, even at the cost of everything else. I am able to state clearly, for whatever record this testimony provides, that the Imperium survives through evil made mundane, through genocide made policy, through murder made necessary through commitment to maintaining systems that require it. This is the truth the dates revealed. This is what lies beneath the prayers and proper documentation. This is what the Basilica Mortis actually honors, not the dead, but the system that manufactures their deaths and calls it justice. If you are reading this, you likely already know this truth and have chosen to maintain it, or remain complicit in its operation. If you are reading this and do not know, you will either dismiss it as heresy or find yourself facing the same choice I faced: accept the doctrine as necessary or refuse and face removal. I cannot tell you which choice is right. I cannot tell you whether systematic evil is justified if the alternative is extinction. I cannot tell you whether the Imperium's survival is worth the cost of millions of predetermined deaths. I can only tell you what I chose, and what that choice cost me, and what remains after everything else is taken away. The right to refuse. The ability to say this is wrong. The conscience that forced exile rather than continued complicity. That is all I have. That is all anyone who refuses truly has. But it is mine, preserved through the only choice I could make with integrity. My name is Dalton Kane. I am exiled to redemption's end for refusing to document systematic murder as justice. I have written this testimony knowing it accomplishes nothing except recording truth that will not change how the system operates. But someone needed to write it. Someone needed to state what the Imperium actually is. Someone needed to refuse even when refusal was futile. I am that someone. This is my testimony. This is what the dates revealed. This is the truth beneath the benedictions. The Emperor protects, but protection demands sacrifice. And sacrifice, I learned, is often just another word for murder made necessary through repetition until no one questions whether it should occur at all. I questioned. I refused. I was exiled. The system continues, but so do I, futile and irrelevant and unable to change anything, but alive and able to maintain the conscience that cost me everything except the ability to say, this is wrong. That must be enough, because it is all I have left.